Right. Well, there is a deluge of ideas and insights, and I invite you now to raise issues, pose questions, challenge what's been said in those territories around affordable drug development, around changing models of healthcare. We've got changed needs but an unchanged system, around the data deluge and how we can prepare for it, and integrating physical and mental health care. Who'd like to start? Chris.
Very interesting series of presentations, Chris Edwards. I just wonder if I could perhaps pick Annette and perhaps and Simon, put you together in a particular way. I mean, when you're trying to choose targets, actually, as far as what your company does, I mean, obviously, you're a profit-making company. You've got shareholders, and you've got to actually focus very much: is this going to be profitable? And the question really is: have we got the right model? Does that, in fact, influence you in terms of where you're going? And if it does, should we actually think? I mean, in another area of business that I'm closely connected with, which happens to be the geothermal business, there was a very interesting thing which we take advantage of, in fact, in East Africa. It's called the Geothermal Risk Mitigation Facility, where the German government actually puts up money, and the DFID does now as well, in order to encourage people to go into that particular area. And I think that there are quite a lot of areas, in fact, in the pharmaceutical business where one would feel that you could decrease the risk by having some sort of scheme like that. So the question is, are we choosing, in fact, actually in the appropriate way? How could we help you, in fact, choose things more readily? And then linking the two of you together, this question of Simon very clearly saying you wanted to actually to get better outcomes at lower cost. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that what we've got to do, if we're going to do that, is to have almost a register of success, because you said 25 years. Do people know it? How are we actually publicising this? And if you take, for example, the treatment of hepatitis, and you've got an expensive drug, we now know that you can predict the 50% of people who will, in fact, actually respond to it. And if we, in fact, were using the expensive drug, in fact, in the genetic test, we're dramatically reducing the cost. So it's a question of how do we actually focus on these things? How do we make this not just better medicine, but actually something which quite clearly becomes more affordable and common sense?
Do you want me to start?
Oh, yes.
Please.
Okay. So the first question was really, how do we select our targets, and how much is that driven by the commercial return, I think, to put it in simple terms. Actually, I guess we believe that science science and innovation is going to lead the way. There is no way that you can predict today what medicines are going to be successful. I showed you the attrition rates. I gave you some statistics around the attrition rates. So what we're driven by is what is of highest medical need, and what are the very best targets with the most biological, genetic, clinical evidence that we have that they're going to be successful in development. Because it takes so long as well, it takes some good 10 years to develop these drugs, we are very driven by medical need, ability to differentiate, value to the patient. That has been a changing environment over the last decade. I think what you also see, though, is there's been incredible waste in the R&D expenditure because of the high attrition rate during development in the last few decades. Now we're making changes there, and we're improving, because as we improve the confidence in the target we select, we're going to be successful more of the time. There's going to be less waste in research and development, and we're going to be able to plough that back into new medicines. Now, clearly, some of these precision medicines, you gave an example of being able to screen out those patients that aren't going to be responsive to a medicine. When you look at it from the perspective of just the cost to develop, I don't think you get the whole picture. You have to look at the whole cost of the treatment, hospitalization, acute care, the whole picture. And we are wasting a lot of money on medicines that are not as effective as they could be in some patient groups in the past. So I think the only way forward is to better predict which patients are going to be the best responders, to to our medicines, to become more efficient and effective in R&D so that we can lower the cost of research and development. That is, my theme there was, I gave you many ways in which we're trying to do that. We need to do that in order to reduce the cost of R&D. But just wheedling out all the medicines that are unsuccessful is going to recruit considerable funds to be able to be more effective in research. So I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, mental health is a huge market and a really important one. What's interesting, if you look back at the history of many of the changes and drug discoveries in psychiatry, most of them have actually been fairly serendipitous. And one of the rather interesting things going on now, partly out of cost, but also out of interest, is the kind of repackaging or finding new uses for very well-established drugs. And in the next few years, I suspect we're going to see anti-inflammatories make a big appearance in psychiatry. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that would happen. And then the second thing, to answer your question, Chris, I have to kind of mention this because it's really important. I mean, we've got 3 or 4 now very big multi-center grants on the IMI, the pre-competitive collaboration program for autism, for schizophrenia, and one called Europain, which obviously is for pain. That would not be a surprise that it is that. And of course, they're all European. And it's about time many people here, and all of us, and Stephen, you were saying this over the weekend, but would point out we can't sleepwalk into a Brexit, because that is going to affect all of those in a really big way, and particularly in places like psychiatry, where we need big collaborations, where we're dealing with common disorders, sure, but probably a lot of incredibly small risk effects, which you need huge studies across Europe to unravel and to develop treatments for. And I think it's I don't apologize for saying this. We need to make that very clear to people. These are some of the issues that we're going to face in June.
Can I just push you a little harder, Annette, on the precision medicine issue by asking whether a company such as GSK worries about what might be called a market failure if the real believers in precision medicine turn out to be right. In other words, we will turn out in medicine to be managing a lot of rare diseases. So what we now think of as common diseases, we will now begin to subfractionate as we understand the molecular pathogenesis and genetic risk. So the market for any one drug is going to shrink. So the reason perhaps that we haven't been very good at producing new antibiotics is that there hasn't been a great market for it. Now, if that applies to many other common diseases, is that something that GSK worries about or doesn't worry about?
I think I wouldn't say we worry about it. That's not how I would phrase it. What I would say is we recognize that we're moving in, and we are currently researching. We have a rare diseases portfolio within GSK. As part of one of the areas that we're working on. And we know that there are over 3,000 rare diseases with very small numbers of patients. But if we're able to understand the pathophysiology of those that we choose, and we are successful in designing very small studies to prove efficacy, and we can get accelerated review and strong uptake, we will have a much more profitable, in the end, and better patient outcomes than the model we have today. So I think we recognize that in a world where some of your portfolio, and it's not going to be all of it in the next 5 years, but some of it is going to be targeting much smaller volume products. The cost of developing those medicines needs to be reduced, and in addition, we need to have ways to get, for these highly innovative medicines which we know are targeting the disease, potentially even curing it, that the uptake is fast. I think the other thing I would say is, our model in the past has been one of treating a few patients in the world, a percentage of the 6 billion. There are other ways, there are other models, and what we really want to do is ensure that access to every patient in every rare disease or precision medicine that we go after is going to get is going to have the opportunity to take that medicine.
Yeah.
So that would be, we're obviously doing a lot of thinking about it. I mean, you will have seen in the FT a few days ago the, what's happening with the first gene therapy for ADA-SCID, where we're looking at new reimbursement and costing models. And I think we need to work together to deliver what are those new reimbursement models in a sustainable healthcare system.
John Patterson.
Thank you. I wonder, Robert, if the event has failed to address one of the major issues by not giving more prominence to primary care. Many other things are represented today, but not directly primary care, although some of the speakers, in fairness, have referred to it. But that is one of the big issues, isn't it?
Yep, I think you're right. What would you like to say, John? We seem to be happy to be insulting our colleagues today, so feel...
It's interesting. I mean, Simon referred to it critically in your IT system, that you've now linked to primary care. So presumably on the IT and the data front and the way that you link with them, you're doing well.
Before you wrecked my marriage, I wasn't criticising primary care. I'm not allowed to, I can't go home and do that one. It wasn't them at all. It was the information governance, but trying to link the two. It was nothing to do with GPs.
What I'm getting at, Simon, if we go back 20 years, the area of medicine that might have been missing from the panel and the presentations would have been mental health. What I'm concerned about is that the area of presentation that's missing from the panel today is somebody from primary care. Is that fair? Or?
I think that is a fair comment, and I think it's also, it's a very obvious observation that academic primary care is limited in this country. And I think that has to be a system failure, because if we accept the argument that we're moving towards more community-based delivery of healthcare, which I think seems to me to make compelling sense, then there needs to be more equipment for research in that context. And Annette talked about real-world data. I mean, that doing trials in the context of their normal lives seems again to be desirable. So I think there's a lot of infrastructure, and we're not training a lot of research competent GPs.
Can I make an observation, Robert, which is that John used the phrase primary care, and it seems to me we've slipped into thinking, well, that must mean general practice. Actually, primary care starts with the Citizens Advice Bureau. It's the social care, it's the social housing manager, it's the pharmacist. It's a full understanding. As I suggested in my remarks, we need to stop and think about what the need is we're trying to respond to, and how best to harness human and financial resource to deal with that, and to avoid illness as well as treating it. And primary care is as much about avoiding it as it is about treating it.
Yeah. David.
Thanks. David Adams from the University of Birmingham. I wonder if one of the issues that comes into a lot of the discussion we've had so far is that as opportunities increase, whether that's in precision medicine or in big data, it seems that our governance and regulatory bodies become increasingly risk averse. And so just two examples. One is that I work in liver disease, so a group of hepatologists have been trying to lobby the FDA to move away from using a liver biopsy as an endpoint for every clinical trial in liver disease. Well, patients don't want to have a liver biopsy. It doesn't give you the information you need, but it's always been the way trials have been done, so that's the way it must always be done in the future. And if you think about the issues around big data, I mean, as Simon is saying, the data are there, but trying to access them and use them. So, we've had a lot of problems in Birmingham in trying to link the data that Julie and UHB are generating into computing systems in the university where we can really analyse them and crunch them. So do we need to think different ways and work with our regulatory authorities to think differently? And in the context of the big data, maybe coming back to Julie's point, actually give the data to the patient rather than thinking this is something that the government must protect on behalf of the patient.
I mean, I think one of the problems, funnily enough, is actually the governance structure we have in this country is pretty good, to be honest. I mean, the Data Protection Act, for example, is actually a very good piece of legislation. The problem is that no one knows what it says. And the people who are supposed to, the data controllers are supposed to be controlling it are particularly bad at knowing what it said. And I did slip in that we'd managed to link, we have very big data sets from the military, and we've linked them with the whole of the criminal justice system, which was thought to be impossible and illegal, and it's neither of those things. On the back of that, we then used Chris to do the same, and we've also linked with the whole of the DWP data set, which again was thought to be impossible, but actually is possible. You can do it, you just have to persevere and go through the hurdles, but actually the system we have is a good one if people know how to use it. And then, of course, we've had the care data fiasco, which was, again, was a fiasco of how it was done and implemented. The systems themselves and the legal framework was perfectly sound.
Janet, I'm conscious we've got the boss of the Health Research Authority on the front row, who I'm sure is interested in some of these issues. So, Janet, at any point that you would like to make an intervention, just give me some kind of signal. I don't want to drop on you when you...
But I think the point about having a system that enables people to answer questions they think they can't is a really very valid one. And that's one of the things that the Health Research Authority that we've wanted to encourage people to do. Because they often come to us and say, we don't think we can do this. And we say, well, let's find a way so that we can.
That's true. Yeah, you're doing well.
Yeah. First in the middle.
Thank you. Christine Hancock, C3 Collaborating for Health, which is about preventing chronic disease. But I'm an economist and not a scientist, and I saw the question as being about the chronic productivity problem we have in this country, and in particular in the health service. And so I wondered whether the panel might just touch on that, and whether it's Simon Wessely's approach at handling stress, which is the major cause that people give for absenteeism in the health service and wider, or Julie's approach to a management culture that makes people feel able to work more. I guess you might have a lower sickness absence rate than some of the other trusts you've talked about, or Stephen's one of focusing on values so people really know why they're there, or whether it's something altogether different that we should be looking at.
Thank you. We analyse our staff sickness. It is quite low, and the stress and the problems people are reporting to us now tend to be outside work, and that's a lot to do with current economic situation, partners being out of work and all the rest of it. But I think in terms of productivity, we've had a lot of requirements put upon us that don't add to productivity, and we measure things in very bizarre ways. About 7 years ago, I got somebody to estimate, because clearly as chief executive I didn't really work myself, I got people to actually look at how many people we were employing purely to feed beasts. And at the time it was over £2.5 million worth, and it's only gone up. I also look at some other measures we're asked to look at. We've made a big thing about nurse staffing. And on the day that we were being measured for nurse staffing, we had 6 nurses on a 22-bedded ward, which was entirely right. But when you actually added up the rest of the staff on that ward, when you added up the therapists, the housekeeping assistants, the pharmacists, there were 23 staff on the ward. And we started to, it's a bit like I said before, we measure the things we can measure, and we measure the things we think are consistent, but we miss what we should be looking at really, and we miss the quality implications of stuff. So we've become more inefficient in many, many ways, and people start off with the best of intentions, but it goes badly, badly, badly wrong. And we're taking away, I think, the discretion of people to manage their own wards, departments, areas, and dare I say hospitals, by what starts off as being a safety net to stop people falling through cracks, becomes a cargo net and holds people down. And so we've become more inefficient, probably with people with good intentions, but it's had the completely opposite effect sometimes, in my view.
Anybody else want to comment on that issue? Stephen?
Yeah. Can I offer? I also like to think. I'm not sure whether this is true, but anyway, I know a little bit. I certainly know more about economics than I do about clinical science, but that's a very, very low bar. And the economist's test is to take the inputs and look at the outputs, the outcomes, and see whether we're using the resource available as effectively as possible. The management, the culture in the health service is almost to be completely blind to the outcomes. We focus almost entirely on inputs. You can't possibly know anything about productivity unless you know what you're delivering for the inputs you measure. We only measure one side of the equation, so we are almost by definition, we are willfully blind about our productivity because we don't understand, we don't test ourselves. We're not. I'm overstating it, but the default instinct is to measure the inputs rather than to focus on the outcomes achieved. And until we know both, we have no measure of productivity.
Yeah, over here.
Hi, my name's Habib. I'm a cardiology registrar. I'm particularly concerned about false positives, actually, in the data that's out there. And for us, particularly working in hospital medicine, there's a lot of pressure to be involved in research, doing MDs, doing PhDs. Often people who are doing them aren't actually that interested in research, but need to do them because that's what they need to do in order to secure a consultant post. And there's already good, data that shows that about 90% of research findings are false positives. And if people are getting involved in doing research and aren't even that interested in it, I wonder about whether or not their time and that money is well spent. So, before the research can improve productivity, what is being done by Health Education England and the Royal Colleges to make sure that people are actually doing good quality research in the first place?
Right, well that was not a question I was expecting, but it's a perfectly justifiable question. So I think, I'm sure others will wish to comment, but I'd say one or two things. I mean, the first is, I'm disappointed to hear you observe, and I'm not challenging your observation, I'm just disappointed that it's what you've seen, that people are doing research for the wrong reasons. That certainly was true when I was at your stage in my career, particularly surgeons. I mean, the amount of crap research done by surgeons to get their MS in order to get, was...
So glad that's changed.
But you don't see MSs very much now. So I don't, in my environment, I don't see that going on, but I'm not denying that you do see it. It's disappointing if that's true, and that is a perverse incentive. In terms of the reproducibility issue, that is a very live issue in the world of medical science at the moment. As you know, there's a lot of focus on it. In fact, the Academy has itself done some focus on it. There's some very sensible guidelines now coming out about how to improve reproducibility, and the journals are playing a very sensible part in that, and better design of models, better exchange of data, and so on and so on. So we all need to be vigilant about that. The final thing I'd say, and I don't know, you may know this, is that in terms of the relationship between research and clinical outcomes, there is very compelling data now that the centres that enter most patients into trials are the centres that have the best clinical outcomes. So, whatever reservations you may have about research, I mean, I think there's a pretty compelling case that we should be doing it for the sorts of reasons that have come out. But does anybody else want to?
I'd just like to add that, one point of hope out of the whole discussion is there's two things really coming together here. One is, I think the common thread of many of the observations that we are going more to a population-based model of healthcare, primary care, out-of-hospital care delivered at home, etc., enabled, it has to be in over the next decade by ever increasing, ever improving pool of data to run this, because you can't manage patients remotely, etc., or in home settings, etc., if you don't have tags on them and data to make sure everything is fine. Mm-hmm. The second order effect of that is that you will have a much richer ability to do sensitivity testing and or coherence testing for research of any kind, because and that's the beauty of this may not happen over the next 3 years, but if you build larger and more connected data lakes, you can essentially begin to do research without necessarily setting up your data collection up front, because you can just look in the lake what's there in real time, and that will revolutionize the ability to do research, but also it will help if you feel the need to quality check something, to reproduce something which somebody has done.
Mm. One of the areas in which there's been the greatest concern of reproducibility has been in psychology psychiatry. There was a paper published 18 months ago that said 75% of all findings in psychiatry and psychology weren't reproducible, but you'd be very amused to learn that particular paper itself has not been reproduced, which I find incredibly amusing and very ironic. It couldn't be replicated when someone tried to do it again.
Miles? Yeah.
Well, you cast a challenge there, haven't you, about crap research by surgeons. I wonder how many people in this room are grateful for the crap research that's allowed them to have their hips and knees replaced, judging by the age profile, quite a lot, I should think. So having cooled down on that, let's take a piece of surgical research which actually leads into the title of this particular symposium. What can research do to improve productivity in the NHS? And Stephen raised this, and I must say Stephen's support when we were setting up NHS health technology assessment, a lot of which was good surgical research, was crucial. But the problem that comes in relationship to implementation, I want to give a historic one and one in the press today. And that's the time that it takes for research findings to be implemented. And I think particularly of the development of trauma centres. The actual development of trauma centres, from irrefutable proof that 30% of patients were dying unnecessarily, repeated studies, we kept on repeating them, showing it's still 30%, took nearly 30 years. It was introduced 3 years ago. And I just wonder, when we've got a similar thing in the press today, because it's about stroke, and if you've seen the supplement in the Times about direct intervention and its success, I suppose I could just turn to Gary here and ask him, but nevertheless, the problem is that politicians actually play quite a heavy role in obstructing these developments because they affect their local hospitals. And today's suggestion is that we should have about 12 centres doing thrombectomies for stroke. So it's a question to Stephen particularly, but to others as well. How can we actually overcome this? Because this research will improve productivity in the NHS, but it's often politically obstructed.
Thank you, first of all, for the kind words you said at the beginning, but on the basis this is a class action, I'd better address the issue that is a challenge to all politicians, which is, and it goes back to what I said in my opening remarks, that we have to make the case for change. It's a changing sector. If we have the point you made about trauma centres is that it's incontrovertible. There's equally strong evidence clearly there, in particular in London, about how different service organisation can deliver better stroke outcomes. But I just want to recount an anecdote, actually, because this is something that exists in this country, but in other countries as well. I was at a symposium, not dissimilar to this, and we were talking about the need for service redesign of the kind I was talking about. And everyone agreed about the need to do it. And it was people from, I won't bore you with the reason, but from the French healthcare system and from the Japanese healthcare system, with a few Brits as observers. And the French journalist who was chairing it at the end said, well, that it's very straightforward, it seems to me, he said, that whether you're talking in Japan, whether you're talking in France, or whether you're talking in the UK, there are 3 Ps, there always are in the modern world 3 Ps, that obstruct necessary change. And his 3 Ps were pricing systems, we might say the tariff, small p politics, which is vested interests right through the system, and capital P politics, which are the elected politicians. And that struck a very strong chord with me. I completely agree with you about democratic politicians, the councillors and the MPs, but I also think it's true to say that our incentives in the system are perverse, in particular through the tariff. And I also think that there are often vested interests which protect traditional models of care. And we have to address all 3 of them. And it's part of what Julie and I are engaged in Birmingham and Solihull, is looking within a more manageable geography at how those 3 Ps are all addressed to change the service model, to introduce a dynamic for change rather than an instinct to protect. And the instinct to protect is there for all 3 of those Ps, not just one of them.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest concern, I think, around the Lansley reforms was the loss of SHAs. And the London SHA, not all the SHAs were very S, but the London SHA, or NHS London, was. And I'm sure you know that was what rationalised hyperacute stroke services in London with manifest improvement in outcomes. The same thing for trauma centres. But now, who is doing that? Who has got the authority to do that system leadership? And it's not entirely clear. Did you want to comment on this?
I was want to make that point.
Chris, anybody who's not... Yeah, sorry.
Peter Johnson from Cancer Research UK, and this is to follow on slightly with your question about geographical scope. And I was sitting here feeling exercised about how the fantastic model in Birmingham might be rolled out and might be made applicable across the whole UK, and was seized by the horrific thought that we might have a national programme for IT in the NHS. and also thinking about Nicolaus's comments about the use of data and how one gets one's hands around a usable amount of it, and how your data lake, if you like, is of a size which is meaningful and not just something we drown in. And I wonder if you'd like to speculate, and it comes back a bit to the question of SHAs and strategic networks, about what might be the optimum size of organisation which we require to do this, because that does seem to me to be fundamental to how we approach making this something which is national rather than local. It's clear that there are some organisations which are just too small, and equally the national one is just too big.
One thing that always surprises me about IT is we never had a business plan for the internet or for email, and yet we all exist on it. And we make such heavy weather out it in health system. We talk about things like interoperability. I don't need to say to you which email system you want so I can send you an email. If the demand's there and users use it intelligently, the manufacturers will make it happen. And I think we've made such a dog's dinner of it in this country that people are scared of it now. And I do think that I would personally make it a quality requirement, because of it, the quality benefits of introducing an intelligent IT system are so great and the patient benefits are so fantastic. It just needs to be, we need to say this is the norm, that actually everybody needs to introduce such a system. And I think we need to be far smarter about saying, and let's just not buy, the one that's buy one that for the right reasons, that's centred on patient benefits, and just introduce it. And I think we say we're short of money in the country, but actually there still is quite a lot of money clicking around for things like sequins and other incentives. And for my mind, this would be the biggest improvement in patient quality as a nation. The spin-off benefits in terms of the data, the stuff that Simon's done with data, are so great. I think it's absolutely something we should just do. And if ever there was a time for a central directive, it should come from there. But tell us what to do, not how to do it. This is a quality standard. The trap we all fall into is we come out and tell everybody exactly how to. I mean, I have actually sent an email back to somebody saying, which end of the egg would you like me to stick the straw in to suck it? Because, you are often told exactly how to do something, but we need to have some freedom to innovate and to get on as well. But let's set some quality standards that are really meaningful. in this country, and that's what I would do. I have suggested that to people, funnily enough.
Never heard that. Extraordinary.
Without diving too much into technology, the core implication of what I was saying before is that the barrier of, if you wish, technology being the bottleneck for this is basically gone away. So we don't need large national agreed programs prescribed anymore. We can literally link anything with anything. And the right entity to do that is the relationships at a geographical level, like Oxford or parts of London or all of London, these kind of levels. There are more or less intelligent ways to get to that point. The more intelligent ways, either you can wait for a very long time. This will happen. One very interesting example to watch is what the Americans do with their state innovation funds. They essentially ask states of the size of, for example, Arkansas, 3 million people, to apply for innovation money to change their whole data system, essentially. In order to do that, they need to come up with a plan which actually is agreed by all players and all providers in all of Arkansas, which is 142. And if they don't agree, they don't get any funding. Out of the 52 states, 27 have a program running, out of which 11 have advanced this with, by the way, excellent professional support. And what they have essentially done is define the standard, what is actually a good HIP procedure, what is, etc., and agreed how to risk adjust. Basically defined what is good and what's bad care, and then begin to literally measure down to the provider or even individual doctor level quality, and adjusted payments with that, and went to basically episode or even annual tariffs of care. Now it's early days, we don't know whether this model exactly will work, and they solve a lot of problems they have which we don't have here. It is just the higher level idea. I think is something the NHS England tries but hasn't quite gotten to yet. I would say, in essence, to focus transition and innovation money on change rather than on bailout, so to speak. That's the fundamental idea, and there is significant transformation and change money in the system. Are we using it right now for these kind of things, which we just talked about, or are we using it for, keeping something open, which probably is not sustainable anymore? That's coming back to the politics, I think, but that would be a way to accelerate things. The good news is, even if this doesn't happen, data lakes will exist, and they will exist very, very soon. They will maybe start in other sectors, and maybe consumers will begin to experience in banking, in insurance, and in other areas of their life what is possible, and they will demand sooner or later this in healthcare, and it is sooner or later going to happen. Some are further advanced than others, of course, then to act on this.
Can I come back to Stephen, and then I'll come to you, Chris. So I don't personally know anybody who doesn't accept that part of the answer is to integrate secondary care, primary care, and social care. I go on to say that I don't think I'm not aware of anywhere in the UK that has really properly done that with a sort of level of aggression, if you want to use that, or radical change that is necessary to deliver a dividend in terms of patient outcomes and cost benefit. What concerned me slightly about your thesis was that I worry that you're making the perfect the enemy of the good by saying we don't just need to do that, we need to take on housing and education. And so if the ambition is too big, we might get stuck. So what practically do you think is achievable, and how should we set about doing it?
Well, it's a very neat lead in, actually, to the question about what's the right geography. Your comment, Robert, that you bemoan the loss of the leadership. I'm not sure you particularly bemoan the loss of the SHA, but you bemoan the loss of that capacity in the system. And it links directly to the point about the politics of this as well, because that, it seems to me, in an imperfect world, one of the better thoughts around at the moment is the STP process. Because it might not be a perfect geography, but it's certainly better. 40 is better than 200. And it's also different in that it explicitly includes politics. And one of the challenges for the NHS is to ensure that the STP process does what is described as part of the objective, which is to reach beyond the NHS within the STP and to engage with local government. Now, that necessarily includes social care. I think it's worth reflecting. I agree with you that it isn't being done properly anywhere. It isn't actually being done properly anywhere on the planet. This is relatively new territory. But in this country, the person who's thought most seriously about this thus far, I think, is Sir Howard Bernstein, the man leading Devo Manc. And when he presents the case for more joined up health and care and broader public services, he doesn't start by saying this is about better public services. He starts at absolutely the other end of the telescope. And he says this is about creating livable cities. This is about public services as a support for a social policy objective of livable cities where people can earn their living, where their people have fulfilling lives, where they avoid unnecessary interfaces with the health and care system. So that's why I include education and other broader public services, that the social policy objective is to create a livable city. Now, if you're going to do that as a service, as a process led by, ultimately, local government, it does reach outside health and social care. But as Julie's heard me say in Birmingham, the danger here is we're trying to boil the ocean. And what we have to do is to set out a vision and then month by month, quarter by quarter, year by year, be seen to be making progress towards it. So you've got to have a clear direction of travel, in my view, but you've also got to demonstrate that you're doing something, as I said, quarter by quarter.
Yeah. Chris?
Yes, just a comment on Stephen and then a question. I think it is being done very, very clearly. The model, in fact, that's been adopted in Valencia, the Alzira model, is exactly this. They've brought primary care, secondary care and social care together, physically together. They use the same IT system. They've demonstrated very clearly they've reduced hospital admissions by 51%. They actually have a capitation system for it. Very simple rule: if effectively a patient isn't happy and they go to another hospital, you have to pay 100% of their costs. So it's worth looking in detail at that. To me, that's a worked example of how, in fact, it can work, and it's key. But the question, it's to me very difficult to have a conversation about productivity unless we actually talk about the size of the workforce. And we have an extraordinary situation in this country where over a 10-year period, we actually went from 100,000 to 150,000 doctors with actually virtually no change in the productivity of the workforce. And we're sort of, sitting around here, actually academic workforce hardly changed at all. And I think if we actually were going to have a real conversation about this, we would start looking at what the individuals are contributing and how we might actually make them, in fact, realise that they have got to be key to changing the model.
Could I just respond to your first point on Valencia? In the world I live in, psychiatry has been an amazing success in moving from secondary to community care. 50 years ago, 97% of all psychiatry was done in hospitals. Now it's actually about 5%. Huge, unrecognised shift. The only problem is, I use specifically the word community care, we're no closer to primary care than we were 54 years ago, even though we often share the same premises. And the reason for that, unfortunately, it's the god of small things. It always falls down on contracts, pensions, IT, car park, all of the really difficult things that we've never been able to integrate, where we have two very different ways of providing care that are financed differently, have different careers, and so I obviously live with a GP, but we often share premises with GPs, but we're not really that much closer to them than we were 40 years ago, although we have massively switched from secondary into community care. An amazing success story.
I think this is consistent with, we've done some research of 40 integrated, really well-functioning integrated care systems in the world. And if you study what do the ones which are doing well get right, there's a number of things which we don't have time to go through. The main implication is very, very deep integration within the provider side. Just, just governance bodies or Wednesday evening workshops or, even payment incentives by themselves are not enough to achieve the level of integrated care actually requires. And there are 3 popular solutions to that. Either get the whole thing sorted and really take 10 years and really do it, build the relationships and create the integrated parts, etc., etc. It's not fast, but it's possible. The second option is if you don't have time for that, there is a fast-growing set of examples which I would call carve-outs. That are organizations which integrate care around a very specific patient segment, for example, frail elderly or people with certain long-term conditions, and basically focus on cohorts just with that particular need and create all that care and carve them out of the rest of the system. And the third one is more the hope model of the accountable care organization, where you kind of create the incentives at the top to collaborate, but then hope that the care organizations actually create the integration under that. Which is faster, but probably not as deep.
Can I mention one word that was fashionable post-Francis? There was, for about 12 months post-Francis, there was a word, you never went to an NHS meeting or a health and care system meeting without somebody lecturing you about culture.
Yeah.
And it's quite instructive that we're talking about change, and we're talking about payment systems, and we're talking about structures. Actually, Simon's point about having how does it possibly be that we ended up with a community health system separate from a primary healthcare system with different cultures in them? And until we address, of course it's about removing barriers, but it's also about new behaviours.
Actually, I'm not even sure that is quite true, because the culture is very similar in primary care and in mental health. It really is. It's not. It's the pension system and the IT system and the contract system, the way that's what's different. I get on very well with GPs, funnily enough.
We're moving towards a finish. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about healthcare and social care and all that being integrated, and people living better and having more fulfilling lives and things like that. I was just wondering what the limit is. When you can justify something on the basis of it being in someone's best interests, and there's more involvement of the state in the private lives of individuals. Where do you draw the line? And I wonder about there's a kind of a security issue, I suppose. And also, the other second point related to that is, at what point are you taking away individual responsibility as well? That's kind of a theoretical construct, I suppose, but it is a bit of a concern.
Stephen, I think that's one for you probably.
My answer to that is to emphasise that what I described is a world where precisely that it isn't led by a public service agenda. You start out with a social policy, a set of social policy objectives, which in a democracy are not. That's part of what the political process is about clarifying what the social, economic, political objectives of the society are. And livable city, it is precisely about having cities with spaces in them, with fulfilling employment, with a broader vision of a fulfilling lifestyle, including individual responsibility, and that balance is as old as the political process. So start with that, rather than starting with how we're going to share data between the social care system and the healthcare system, because you'll never get there if that's the question. It's the wrong question.
Okay, so time is just about up. Before I make one or two summarial remarks, are there any comments that any of the panel members wish to make, something that has occurred to you that you feel is unsaid that needs to be said? If not, then let me try to sum up. I'm going to sum up by saying that actually it leaves me feeling quite optimistic because I think that we've heard some achievable solutions to what is a very challenging problem. So from Julie, there's a very strong message about the importance of high quality leadership and high quality management to address the issues in a practical way that helps the user or the service deliverer really do their job properly. And that's not empty talk because she's done it. And I think if she's done it, then others can do it. So the idea of firing 30% of the NHS chief execs, that might be a bridge too far for now. But I think that was a very clear message and a very important one. Annette, I think, talked very eloquently about essentially intelligent drug design becoming more sustainable, more affordable, and relying on the sorts of partnerships that this Academy Forum is designed to foster. Stephen, reflecting on changed needs with an unchanged model, I think it's just that the arguments are so strong that sooner or later we will do it. Why we haven't quite managed to do it yet, I don't know, but I've little doubt that we will do it. It seems to me a moral obligation. And then Nico's challenge around data, and it won't be too long before artificial intelligence overtakes human intelligence. I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but I certainly think that the message about training the workforce for the future to begin to anticipate the needs that are going to exist if we're going to avail ourselves of the data opportunity is a very important one. And then, Simon, I know it's your slide, it's a wonderful slide. I'll continue to use it because I think it's so important that we overcome Cartesian dualism, A, for patients and B, for cost. So I think there are some really tangible solutions. I don't know of any agency, and tell me if you do over drinks, but I don't know of any agency that is really thinking in an integrated system way about what the future of healthcare is going to look like and what we need to be doing in order to prepare for it and what the research capabilities needs to be in order to stay ahead of the game. So that's why this afternoon was set up. I think it's been very fertile, and we, the Academy, will think about what ongoing contribution we might be able to make. But can I thank these fantastic panelists very much for a wonderful time. I apologize for insulting the Emeritus Professor of Surgery in my alma mater. You probably were there when I was. I love surgeons. So can you thank the panel very much?